Keanu Reeves had seen a lot in his time in Hollywood: adulation, admiration, and even a fair share of tabloid scrutiny. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to experience on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. He walked into the Sweet Spot, a trendy little bakery tucked away on a quiet corner in downtown, craving nothing more than a simple croissant and coffee. He had been looking for some quiet time away from the limelight. A few days ago, he had decided to spend some time out of his usual Hollywood bubble, just trying to blend in for once. Just another guy, getting a pastry and enjoying a cup of coffee. But from the moment he stepped through the door, he could feel it, the buzz. The atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the usual fanfare that followed him when he entered a room. This was something different. The cashier, a young woman in her 20s, looked at him blankly as he approached the counter. Her eyes scanned him quickly, not recognizing him. Keanu had become so accustomed to being greeted with recognition, to being treated like a celebrity in places like this, that the abrupt indifference felt jarring. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat, almost dismissive. Keanu blinked, caught off guard by the lack of enthusiasm, but he smiled politely. "Just a coffee and a croissant, please." The young woman raised an eyebrow, clearly not impressed by his order. She didn't even acknowledge his polite tone, and her fingers typed into the register with disinterest. "That'll be $5.45, Keanu's." Smile faltered just slightly, but he didn't let it show. It wasn't the price that stung. It was the sudden realization that he wasn't being treated like the man who had starred in The Matrix or John Wick. No one was asking for a selfie. No one was gawking or whispering behind their hands. No one cared who he was. He fumbled for his wallet, almost laughing at how alien the situation felt. This was the kind of moment people often dreamed of, a chance to be treated like a regular person. But now that he was in it, he wasn't sure he liked it. There was something strangely uncomfortable about it, something that tugged at him in ways he hadn't expected. He handed her the exact change, and when she took the money, her eyes didn't even meet his. She turned and called out to the back, "1 coffee, 1 croissant." Keanu's stomach churned with embarrassment. He wanted to tell her who he was, to explain that he wasn't just any man off the street, but something about the situation kept him silent. He had never experienced such blatant disregard before. Was this what it felt like to be invisible? To walk through life without anyone seeing you for who you really were? His order was handed to him in a paper bag, with no small talk, no acknowledgement of who he was. He took the bag, nodded, and turned to leave. As he stepped outside, the sun felt a little too bright. The sounds of the city, normally so familiar, seemed to blur into the background as he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. For the first time in a long time, Keanu Reeves felt like just another guy. As he walked down the sidewalk, a question lingered in his mind. What if you could no longer be the star? What if you woke up one day and no one remembered your name? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu walked slowly down the sidewalk, the slight sting of humiliation creeping into his chest. As he sipped the coffee from the Sweet Spot, it tasted bitterer than usual. It wasn't the flavor, it was the feeling that had settled in his gut, a feeling he couldn't shake. He had been in plenty of awkward situations, sure, but this was different. This was the first time in years that he'd been treated like just another person, and honestly, it was unsettling. As he wandered aimlessly through the streets of downtown LA, Keanu found himself questioning everything. He had always been used to the admiration, the friendly nods, the occasional fan asking for a picture. He had always prided himself on being down-to-earth, approachable, even humble. But now he realized just how dependent he had become on the recognition. Keanu stopped in front of a small park, the soothing sound of birds chirping and the distant hum of traffic a temporary distraction. He glanced around and saw people laughing, walking dogs, chatting with friends, and yet no one seemed to notice him, not even a glance in his direction. And for some reason, that felt worse than anything. He thought back to his years in Hollywood, to the moments of fame, the movie premieres, and the admiration he received. But now, sitting alone on a bench in a public park, he couldn't help but wonder, What does all of that mean? What was the point of it all if he couldn't even be seen as a real person? A woman passed by with her dog, her eyes scanning the crowd. As she walked past him, she gave him a quick smile. It wasn't the warm, familiar smile of a fan, but a polite, brief acknowledgement. A courtesy. He wanted to say something, to make a joke, maybe even tell her who he was, but something stopped him. He wasn't Keanu Reeves, the star, anymore. He wasn't the guy people went crazy for when they saw him. He was just another face in the crowd, and it felt strange. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of a phone ringing. Keanu pulled his phone out of his pocket and saw that it was his agent calling. He answered it automatically, though a small part of him didn't want to. He didn't feel like pretending everything was fine. "Hey, Keanu," his agent's voice came through, upbeat as always. "Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Any thoughts on the next project? I've got a few scripts coming your way that I think you'll love." Keanu sighed, rubbing his eyes. "I'm doing all right, just trying to take a breather for a bit, you know?" There was a pause on the other end. His agent knew him well enough to pick up on the tone. "Is everything okay? You sound off. You sound—" Keanu stared at the busy street in front of him, watching the world continue as if nothing had changed. He realized how much he had been holding back in that moment. For a second, he thought about telling his agent everything, about the feeling of being invisible, of no longer being Keanu Reeves in the eyes of the public, but instead he just sighed again. "Yeah, it's just been a strange day, I guess. I'm fine." His agent chuckled, oblivious. "All right, well, I'll send over those scripts. Maybe something will catch your eye. Take care of yourself, all right?" Keanu hung up without responding. He leaned back on the bench, eyes closed, trying to process everything. He felt embarrassed, almost as though he had been punched in the stomach. Not because of anything anyone had done to him, but because of how small he felt in that moment. How insignificant. He had spent so many years being a symbol, a larger-than-life figure, and now he was just forgotten. Was it really all that mattered? Was it possible for a man to be more than the image the world painted of him? "Maybe this is what I needed," he thought to himself, standing up from the bench. "Maybe I need to learn what it's like to just be me, not Keanu Reeves, the actor." Keanu glanced at his phone again, deciding to step away from the limelight, even if, just for a little while, it wasn't fame that had brought him happiness in the end, he realized. It was connection, real human connection. Just as he turned to leave the park, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind him, "Keanu?" Keanu froze. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual shrill voice of a fan who recognized him. Instead, it was soft, warm, and curious. He turned around, unsure of what to expect. Standing there, just a few feet away, was a woman with dark hair, wearing glasses and a cozy scarf, holding a coffee cup in her hand. She was watching him intently, but not with the same intensity most fans would. Instead, there was a knowing smile on her face, one that made Keanu feel strangely comfortable, like she had seen him not as a star, but as just another person struggling through life's challenges. "Sorry to interrupt," she said with a grin. "But I swear I've seen you around before. You look familiar." Keanu's heart raced. Something about this woman felt different from all the others. She wasn't here to ask for a picture or autograph. There was no excitement, no admiration in her voice, just an understanding, a connection that Keanu hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't exactly the encounter he expected. But something about it felt like the beginning of something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something he needed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. This woman, with her gentle smile and calm demeanor, wasn't acting like anyone else he had encountered today. She wasn't gawking at him like most people did, nor was she rushing to pull out her phone to snap a picture. Instead, she simply stood there looking at him with the kind of curiosity that made him feel normal. "Sorry, I didn't mean to stare," she said, taking a step closer. "But you really do look familiar." Keanu took a deep breath, his mind racing. Was he supposed to reveal who he was? He could have easily said something like, "Yes, I'm Keanu Reeves, the actor." but something about her presence made him pause. It was as though he didn't want to be seen as the star. Not today, not right now. No need to apologize, Keanu replied, his voice steady. I get that a lot. She looked puzzled but smiled again, clearly sensing that there was more to him than met the eye. Well, you must be someone important if people keep recognizing you. Keanu chuckled softly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I used to be someone important, but today not so much. There was a brief silence between them, as if the weight of his words hung in the air. She didn't press him for more. Instead, she seemed content to let the conversation flow naturally. So, are you from around here? Keanu asked, trying to steer the conversation to something less personal. Yeah, I live a few blocks away. I'm actually a writer, she explained, adjusting her scarf. I mostly work from home, so I get a lot of time to wander around. I spend a lot of time in this park. It's peaceful, you know. Keanu nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The park was quiet, almost serene, with a few people jogging and others sitting on benches, lost in their own worlds. It was a far cry from the busy, chaotic streets of Hollywood that Keanu was used to. It was a world that felt grounded, untouched by the constant barrage of cameras and fame. I know what you mean, he said thoughtfully. It's nice to escape from everything sometimes. Exactly, she replied, her eyes lighting up with understanding. I think everyone needs a space where they can just be, not be defined by what others think of them. Keanu's heart skipped a beat at her words. Was she speaking to him? It was as though she had somehow tapped into the very struggle he had been feeling all day. He had spent years in the public eye, constantly being defined by his image, by the roles he played on screen. But now, in this quiet park, he was just another person, and it felt liberating, yet unsettling. The truth was, Keanu had always prided himself on being humble. He wasn't the type of actor to let fame go to his head. He preferred to keep a low profile, to live as simply as possible despite the millions of people who admired him. But something had shifted recently. The reality of being constantly scrutinized, of having his every move watched, had begun to weigh heavily on him. You're right, he said slowly, but sometimes it's hard to separate who you really are from what people expect you to be. The woman nodded, her gaze compassionate. I get it. I think we all struggle with that. Even if we're not famous, people have their own ideas of who we should be, what we should do, how we should act. It's exhausting. Keanu looked at her, feeling a strange sense of connection. She was right. He hadn't realized how much he had internalized others' expectations. For so long he had allowed his identity to be shaped by the roles he played, by the image the world had of him. But now in this quiet moment with a stranger, he felt like he was peeling back the layers, exposing the person he had been too afraid to show for years. You know, she said, breaking the silence, if you ever want to get away from it all, you could join me for a writing group. It's small. Just a few of us sharing our stories. No judgment, no expectations. We just talk about the struggles we face and the things that keep us going. It's pretty freeing. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Intrigued. A writing group? Yeah, she said, smiling warmly. We meet every Wednesday. It's not about being a good writer. It's about being honest, about who we are, where we're at. We don't try to fix each other, we just listen. For a moment, Keanu stood still, his mind racing. Could this be what he needed? A space where he could just be himself. No roles, no public persona, no cameras. Just the raw, real version of Keanu Reeves. The thought was both terrifying and exciting. I might take you up on that, Keanu replied, his voice softer than before. I think it could be good for me. She smiled brightly, clearly pleased. Great, we meet in a little cafe near here. I'll send you the details if you want. Keanu pulled out his phone and exchanged contact information with her, the excitement of the possibility starting to settle in. Maybe this was the start of something different, something more authentic. As they said their goodbyes, Keanu walked away from the park, his thoughts swirling. The feeling of humiliation from earlier in the day hadn't disappeared completely, but it had shifted. He wasn't sure what was waiting for him at the writing group, but for the first time in a long while he felt like he was on the verge of something new, something real, and that was the most exhilarating feeling of all. The days that followed the encounter in the park were strange for Keanu. A mix of curiosity and hesitation clouded his mind. The idea of a writing group, of meeting people who weren't interested in his fame or his past, seemed both terrifying and liberating at the same time. He had always sought connection, but could he really strip away everything he had built his identity on? Keanu couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over. The woman, whose name, as it turned out, was Emma, had been so easy to talk to. Her presence had felt like a balm to the constant whirlwind of his life. He had never expected a simple conversation in a park to have such an impact, but it was clear that meeting Emma was the spark he needed. Still, there was hesitation. Keanu had lived so much of his life under a microscope, constantly being defined by other people's expectations. What would it be like to step into a new world where no one knew who he was? He thought about it all weekend. He wandered the streets of Los Angeles, revisiting places he had frequented before, trying to take in the quiet moments that he now longed for. Every cafe, every corner, reminded him of the way things used to be, but none of them held the same magic anymore. Finally, on Wednesday morning, Keanu found himself sitting in a small cafe near the park, the place Emma had mentioned. It was a cozy, unassuming spot, the kind of place where people came for the warmth of the coffee and the comfort of a quiet moment. Keanu glanced at his watch. It was almost time. He had shown up early, unsure of what to expect. He'd told himself that if he didn't show up, he would regret it. So here he was, trying to face the unknown. He was just about to get up and leave when the door opened, and in walked Emma. She spotted him immediately, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. There was no starstruck look, no hint of recognition, beyond what they had shared a few days ago. Just a friendly face and a welcoming smile. "Keanu, you made it," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "I'm so glad you decided to come." Keanu smiled back, feeling a wave of relief. He had feared that his presence might make her uncomfortable, but it seemed as if that wasn't the case. "Yeah, I thought it might be good for me to get out of my head for a bit," he said, standing up and offering her a seat across from him. "Exactly why I love this group," Emma replied. "We're all here to just talk, no pressure." A few moments later, the other members of the group trickled in. There were only 4 of them, 2 women and 2 men, each with their own unique energy. One of the women, a tall brunette named Sarah, gave Keanu a friendly nod, but didn't linger on the fact that he was Keanu Reeves. The other members greeted him politely, but there was no overt recognition, which strangely made Keanu feel more at ease. Emma introduced everyone to each other, and soon they were seated around a small table with notebooks and coffee cups in front of them. "So," Emma began, "the idea is simple. We share a piece of writing, could be anything really, a poem, a short story, or even just a thought. It's a safe space, and if anyone feels like sharing something personal, we're here to listen." Keanu wasn't sure what to expect. He had always been more of a listener than a talker, especially when it came to personal things. His whole career had been built on being the stoic, silent hero, never one to open up about his struggles or his feelings. But today felt different. Today, he was just Keanu, not the movie star, not the action figure, just a guy who wanted to connect. As the group began to share their writings, Keanu listened intently. The stories ranged from humorous to deeply personal. Sarah read a poem about loneliness, and Michael, a soft-spoken man with glasses, shared a short story about finding hope after failure. The group didn't judge, didn't offer advice unless asked. They simply listened. Then it was Keanu's turn. He felt a lump form in his throat as everyone turned their attention to him. He wasn't prepared for this. What could he share that wouldn't feel like a performance? What could he say that felt real? He cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "I didn't really prepare anything," he began, his voice a little softer than usual. "But I guess I can just talk. Maybe that's what I need. To talk about being just a person, you know? Not Keanu Reeves, the actor, but just a guy who's trying to figure things out." There was a brief pause, and then Emma gave him a reassuring nod. "That's exactly what we're here for." Keanu took a deep breath, trying to find the words. "I've spent so much of my life pretending to be someone I'm not, or maybe I've let other people define me. I've been the guy on the posters, the guy in the movies, but who am I really when the cameras are off? And I think for the first time I'm starting to realize that I have no idea who I am outside of that. I've been searching for something real, something meaningful, but I don't know where to start. He looked around at the group, their faces open and attentive. He hadn't expected to feel this vulnerable, but somehow it was easier than he thought. I guess I'm just tired of pretending. The room was silent for a moment, but then Michael, the soft-spoken man with glasses, spoke up. We're all tired of pretending, Keanu. That's why we're here, to figure out who we are when we stop hiding behind masks. Keanu nodded, feeling the weight of his own words. There was a sense of relief in sharing his thoughts with people who didn't expect anything from him, who weren't there to see him as a celebrity, but simply as another human being. He had no idea where this journey would take him, but in that moment, surrounded by strangers who felt more like friends, Keanu realized something important. Maybe the key to finding himself wasn't in the movies or the fame, but in moments like these, in the raw, honest conversations, in the chance to be vulnerable. This group, these people, they weren't here to judge him. They were here to listen, to understand. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Keanu left the cafe that evening feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He had come to the group expecting a casual, maybe even awkward experience. Instead, he found solace in the shared vulnerability of those around him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of being Keanu Reeves, the actor. He was just Keanu, a guy with struggles, fears, and hopes, just like everyone else. As the days passed, Keanu continued to attend the writing group. Each session brought a new wave of reflection. He was no longer just listening to the stories others told. He was starting to share his own. His words, which once seemed so elusive, began to flow more freely. He wrote about the loneliness that came with fame, the emptiness he sometimes felt when the cameras stopped rolling, and the disconnection that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't easy to open up. There were moments when he felt the familiar, urged to shut down, to retreat into the comfortable shell of silence. But each time he shared a piece of himself, the weight seemed to lift just a little more. The group's reactions were always the same, warm, accepting, and free of judgment. It was a rare comfort, one that Keanu had never truly experienced before. One evening, after the group had wrapped up their session, Emma stayed behind to chat with him. She had a soft smile, one that wasn't too eager, but still radiated kindness. "You know you've made a lot of progress," Emma said, her voice gentle but firm. "I can see it in your writing. You're not hiding anymore." Keanu met her gaze, unsure how to respond. He had grown fond of Emma, not because of any romantic notion, but because she had been the first person to truly see him, not as a star, but as a person. Her support had been genuine, and it was something he hadn't known he needed until he felt it. "I'm still figuring things out," he admitted. "There are days when I feel like I'm a step away from completely losing myself in the image I've built. It's hard to escape from it when the world is always watching, but I guess I'm trying." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That's all anyone can do, Keanu. You don't need to have everything figured out right now. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come when you just allow yourself to be, well, human." The word human hung in the air between them. Keanu hadn't realized how much he longed for that simple connection until he'd experienced it. All. His life, he had been told who he was supposed to be. The leading man, the action hero, the perfect stoic figure. But he was starting to understand that he didn't need to be any of those things to be worthy of connection or respect. He took a deep breath, considering her words. He had been running for so long, hiding behind roles and expectations. But now, for the first time in years, he felt like he was standing still, just being. "You're right," Keanu said quietly. "I think I've been scared of letting go of that image, but I want to be real, Emma. I want to figure out who I am without all the noise." Emma smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "You're already on your way, Keanu. You've taken the first step by being here, sharing yourself with others. That's huge." Keanu smiled back, his heart feeling fuller than it had in a long time. He had spent so much time wondering if he could ever escape the pressure of fame. But now he knew that true freedom didn't come from being free of cameras or fans. It came from within. It came from being honest with himself, and in turn, with others. Over the next few weeks, Keanu continued his journey of self-discovery. The writing group became a safe haven for him, a place where he could strip away the layers of his public persona and just be. And in doing so, he began to heal. It wasn't just the writing. It was the conversations, the small, quiet moments where he was reminded that he was not alone. Everyone at the group had their own struggles, their own doubts, and by sharing them, they made each other stronger. Keanu didn't know it at the time, but this group, these strangers who had become something more, were teaching him the most valuable lesson of all, that real connection was not about perfection or fame. It was about being seen for who you truly were. One evening, as Keanu was walking home after the group, he found himself thinking about something Emma had said. The biggest breakthroughs come when you allow yourself to be human. And maybe that was the key to everything. He didn't need to be Keanu Reeves, the actor. He didn't need to live up to anyone's expectations. He just needed to be Keanu, the man who had the courage to face his own flaws, who wasn't afraid to show the world that he didn't have all the answers. That night, as he lay in bed, Keanu realized something profound. The struggle had never been about fame or success. It had always been about finding peace within himself, about accepting who he was, without the need for validation. And in that acceptance, he had found something he hadn't known he was searching for, a sense of belonging. He was still on his journey, still uncertain of where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt hopeful, and that feeling, more than anything, was what he needed to keep going. Keanu's newfound sense of peace was put to the test sooner than he expected. It wasn't long before his quiet life began to feel like it was slipping through his fingers. Fame, as it always did, had a way of creeping back in. One afternoon, just as Keanu was walking out of the local grocery store, he spotted a familiar face. A paparazzi photographer, crouched behind a car, snapping pictures of him as if he were an animal in the wild. Keanu paused, irritation flickering inside him, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and he really was, to let things roll off his back. But the intrusion, the constant reminder of who he was in the eyes of the public, still stung. "Hey, you!" the photographer called out, clearly sensing an opportunity for a more direct shot. "Keanu, over here!" Keanu's stomach tightened. The old reflex kicked in, anger, frustration, the desire to hide. It was so tempting to retreat, to ignore the man and walk away. But Keanu didn't want to run anymore. He had promised himself that instead, he stood tall and walked toward the photographer, the sound of his footsteps growing louder in the silence of the street. When he was within a few feet, he stopped. "Why don't you just leave me alone?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but firm. The photographer blinked in surprise. "What's wrong, Keanu? You don't want your picture taken?" Keanu gave a small shake of his head. "It's not that. It's that I just want a little bit of peace. I'm not a circus act, and I don't want to be treated like one." The photographer hesitated. There was a brief, awkward silence before he snapped another picture. "Sorry, but this is the job." Keanu didn't respond. He stood there for a few moments longer, then turned on his heel and walked away, trying to ignore the flashes that went off behind him. He couldn't help but feel a deep ache inside him. Here he was, trying to live a life of authenticity, to reconnect with the person he wanted to be. And yet, every time he took a step forward, the world around him pulled him back into the identity he had been trying to escape. The anger simmered within him as he made his way back to his apartment. He wasn't sure why this encounter had upset him so much. Maybe it was the lack of control, or the feeling of being helpless against the tide of public attention. Whatever it was, it didn't sit well. He had hoped that by stepping away from the world of Hollywood and embracing a simpler, quieter life, he could somehow avoid moments like this. But the truth was, there was no escaping it. Later that evening, as Keanu sat in his living room with a glass of wine, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma, checking in to see how he was doing. "Hey, just wanted to make sure you're okay. You seemed a little off last time we spoke." Keanu stared at the message for a moment. He had been avoiding talking about the paparazzi incident, pretending it didn't bother him, but he knew Emma wouldn't let him hide his feelings. "It's been a tough day," he typed back. "I'm trying to stay grounded, but sometimes the whole fame thing really gets to me. It's like no matter how much I try to escape it, it's always there." Seconds later, Emma replied, "I get it. That's got to be exhausting. Want to talk about it?" Keanu hesitated. For years he had kept his frustrations bottled up. He had rarely shared the weight of his celebrity with anyone, not even his closest friends. But there was something about Emma's straightforwardness, her ability to create space for honesty, that made him want to open up. "Yeah, I think I do." Within an hour, Keanu found himself sitting in the same cafe where he'd met Emma weeks ago, preparing to have a conversation he knew he needed to have. As soon as Emma arrived, she greeted him with the same warm smile that had become so familiar. She didn't ask questions, didn't push him to talk. She simply sat down, her presence enough to help him breathe a little easier. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked after a few moments of silence. Keanu sighed and rubbed his temples. "It's the constant pressure, you know? You try to live your life, try to find some kind of peace, but the world just won't let you. You take one step forward, and then something like this happens." "And I'm back to where I started," Emma nodded. "It sounds like you're caught between two worlds, the one where you're just a person, and the one where you're expected to be more than human." Keanu stared at her, grateful for how well she understood. "Exactly. I don't want to be that actor all the time, I just want to be me, but it feels impossible." She was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "Keanu, I think you're already doing it. The fact that you showed up here today, that you're talking about it, that's you being real. You can't control the paparazzi or the expectations the world has of you, but you can control how you react. And right now, you're reacting in a way that's honest and that's powerful." Keanu looked down at his hands, thinking, "I don't know if it feels powerful. It just feels, exhausting. The attention, the expectations, the pressure to be on all the time. It's like I'm always performing." Emma's voice softened. "I understand that, and I know it's not easy, but maybe instead of trying to escape it entirely, you can learn how to set boundaries. You don't owe anyone anything except for yourself. If you can learn to find your peace within yourself, even when the world around you feels chaotic, then that's where the real strength lies." Her words were like a balm to his spirit, and for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just fighting against the pressures of fame, he was learning how to exist alongside it on his own terms. He took a deep breath. "Maybe that's what I need to learn, to find balance, not escape. Just balance." Emma smiled. "Exactly, and I think you're on the right track. You don't have to do it alone either. You've got people who care about you, who see you for who you really are." Keanu smiled back, his heart feeling just a little bit lighter. "Thanks, Emma. I think I needed to hear that." As they sat there sipping their coffee and chatting, Keanu realized that maybe, just maybe, the key to overcoming this was no longer trying to outrun the noise. It was about learning to navigate through it, to find moments of calm amidst the storm. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that he could do it. Keanu woke up the next morning feeling unusually calm. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the gnawing pressure of public expectations hanging over him. Instead, there was a quiet, growing sense of peace inside him, a feeling that he was on the verge of something significant, something that could change the way he viewed the world and himself. That afternoon, after finishing a writing group session, he decided to take a walk through the park near his apartment. It was a place he frequented when he needed to clear his head, to separate himself from the noise. The park was quiet, save for the rustling of the trees and the distant sound of children playing. It was a simple place, a natural sanctuary amidst the chaos of city life. As Keanu walked, he found his mind wandering back to the conversation he'd had with Emma the night before. Her words had stayed with him. "You don't have to do it alone. You've got people who care about you." She was right. He had always believed he had to handle everything on his own, that he had to be strong in isolation. But that wasn't true. He had people in his life who genuinely cared, who saw beyond the persona he had built. He paused for a moment, sitting on a bench overlooking a pond. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. Maybe it's time to stop hiding, he thought. Maybe it's time to be truly vulnerable. No more walls, no more pretending. He pulled out his phone and called his manager, Greg. The call went straight to voicemail. Keanu hesitated before leaving a message. "Hey Greg, it's Keanu. I've been thinking about a few things and I need to talk to you. There's a lot I've been keeping inside, and I think it's time to face some of it. Let's set up a meeting when you get a chance. Thanks, Keanu." Didn't know what exactly he was going to say to Greg, but he knew that it was time to have a real conversation, the kind that went beyond business deals and photo ops. It was time to address the toll that fame had taken on him and the reality of living in the public eye. He couldn't keep pushing his emotions aside and pretending that everything was okay. The mask was cracking, and for the first time in years, Keanu didn't want to fix it. He wanted to take it off completely. As he walked further along the path, his mind drifted back to the bakery incident. It had been a strange moment, humiliating, sure, but also eye-opening. That brief encounter with the clerk, the way he had been treated so dismissively, had shaken something inside him. It had reminded him of how little control he often had over how people perceived him. To the clerk, he was just another famous person, a spectacle, an image, nothing more. It wasn't personal, but it was still a painful reminder of how far removed he sometimes felt from the real world. Keanu wasn't naive. He knew that fame wasn't just about the red carpets and the bright lights. It was also about being a target, being scrutinized and being commodified. But now, instead of letting that overwhelm him, he was learning to live with it. To live with the knowledge that while others could try to shape his identity, it was ultimately up to him how he responded. The bakery incident, in a strange way, had shown him something important. He didn't have to let the world dictate how he felt about himself. The way people treated him didn't change his worth. By the time Keanu arrived home, the phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Greg returning his call. Keanu stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the voicemail beep in his ear. "Hey Keanu, sorry I missed your call. Let's catch up tomorrow. I've got a meeting with some people about your next project. I'll text you the details. Talk soon." Keanu stared at the phone, wondering if he was ready for this conversation. Was he ready to lay his cards on the table? To admit that he wasn't the person everyone thought he was? He sat on the couch, staring at the message he had just received from Greg. As much as he wanted to avoid diving into the business side of things right now, he knew he couldn't. The time had come to deal with everything that had been buried for so long. The next day, Keanu met Greg at a coffee shop in the city. It was one of those places that was busy and full of noise, yet somehow it felt like a safe space to have difficult conversations. They sat at a table by the window, the sunlight casting warm rays over the polished wood. "So, what's on your mind?" Greg asked, after a few moments of casual conversation. Keanu took a deep breath. This was it. He had been gearing up for this moment, and now as he looked across the table at Greg, he felt a mix of nervousness and resolve. "Greg, I've been thinking a lot about my career lately, about everything, what I've been doing, where I'm going, and who I am in all of this." Keanu paused, unsure if his words were coming out the way he intended. He could see the curiosity on Greg's face, but there was no judgment. That was good. "Go on," Greg said softly. "I need to take a step back," Keanu continued. "I've been living this double life for so long. I've built a persona, a brand, but I feel like it's taken a toll on me. And I don't want to just be the actor anymore. I want to be more. I want to find out who I really am beyond the image." Greg didn't immediately respond, which was typical. He was always good at listening before offering advice. "I understand," Greg said after a beat. "But you know this is going to change things, right? If you start backing off from the spotlight, there are going to be consequences. People won't understand. It'll affect your career, your public image." Keanu nodded. "I know, but I've spent so many years chasing the next big project, the next opportunity, the next role. I've let myself get lost in it. And now I just want to figure out what I really want. Fame, success. It doesn't matter if I'm not happy. It's time to be real with myself, with everyone around me. Greg sat back in his chair, taking in what Keanu had said. It was rare for Keanu to speak so candidly about his inner struggles. He'd always been a private person, and for him to open up like this showed just how far he had come in his journey of self-discovery. "Well, Keanu, if that's what you really want, then I'm behind you," Greg said finally. "We'll figure out a way to make it work. But just know you're not alone in this. I've got your back." Keanu smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in ages, he felt like he was making a choice that wasn't motivated by fear or obligation. He was choosing authenticity. "Thanks, Greg," Keanu said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I appreciate it." As Keanu left the coffee shop, he felt lighter. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let fear dictate his future anymore. He was going to face the mirror, and this time he was going to like the person who stared back at him. Keanu's decision to pursue a more authentic life was no longer just a theory, it was becoming his reality. The days following his conversation with Greg were filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had taken the first steps towards something he hadn't dared to acknowledge before: a life without the constant weight of expectation. Yet there was a lingering question that still haunted him. Was it enough? He was sitting in his apartment one evening, scrolling through his phone when he came across an article. It was a piece from one of the tabloids, as usual, speculating on his next project, his rumored relationship and every other facet of his life. But this article was different. It wasn't about his acting career. It was a discussion about the infamous bakery incident. The headline screamed, "Keanu Reeves faces humiliation at a bakery. What happens next?" His stomach dropped as he read the contents. The story had been twisted and spun, turning a simple encounter into a spectacle of judgment. Keanu had known that public life came with its drawbacks, but he had underestimated the reach of the media's distortion. This wasn't the first time. They'd gotten things wrong. But the way they had exaggerated the event made him feel small. It made him question whether he would ever escape this cycle. That night, as Keanu lay in bed, his mind kept racing. He thought about the bakery, about his exchange with the clerk, and how easily it had all been blown out of proportion. He couldn't help but feel that no matter what he did, he was always going to be seen through a lens of superficiality. Was it possible to really break free from the public's perception? He reached for his phone and dialed Emma's number. She picked up almost immediately. "Hey, Keanu, how's it going?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. Keanu hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen in his hand. "I saw the article about the bakery incident," he said, his voice quiet. There was a pause on the other end. "I saw it too," Emma replied. "I'm sorry, I know that must be frustrating." Keanu let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Frustrating doesn't even begin to cover it. It's like no matter what I do, the world just keeps making me into something I'm not. I'm not a celebrity, I'm not a star, I'm just me. But that doesn't seem to matter." Emma's voice softened. "Keanu, you can't control what other people say or think about you. You just have to decide what you want your story to be. You've already started to show the world who you really are, and that's more powerful than anything they can say." Keanu leaned back, thinking about Emma's words. She had a way of cutting through the noise, reminding him that he had more control over his life than he often realized. She was right. He had already made a choice. He didn't need to be a part of the narrative the media was trying to sell. He didn't have to be a victim of it. He took a deep breath. "I know, I don't want to keep being defined by other people's opinions. I'm tired of feeling like I'm always on the defense." "I get that. And you don't have to fight every battle. What you can do is keep living your truth and let that speak for itself. You can't change the headlines, but you can control how you respond." Keanu smiled, a little relieved. "You're right. Thanks, Emma." As the conversation ended, Keanu sat quietly, thinking about the journey he had been on. It had been a struggle, no doubt, but each step had brought him closer to a life that was more aligned with who he truly was. And while there would always be challenges, whether it was dealing with the media or confronting his own inner doubts, he felt stronger than ever before. The next morning, Keanu decided to take action. He wasn't going to let one bad experience or a distorted headline define him. He was going to prove that he could live on his own terms without being dragged back into the superficiality of fame. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Greg. "I'm ready to start taking things in a new direction. Let's talk about my next steps." The response came quickly. "Absolutely, let's set up a meeting next week to discuss." For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about stepping away from the media or making a statement. It was about making choices that aligned with his values, his vision, and his true self. Later that day, he found himself at the same bakery, the one where it all started. This time, however, he wasn't there for a quick stop or to grab a coffee to go. He walked in, his heart beating steadily in his chest, determined to change the narrative. The same clerk was behind the counter, looking up with a slight frown when Keanu approached. He could tell she recognized him, but her expression was different. This time, less indifferent, more curious. Keanu smiled, his demeanor calm. "Hi, I wanted to apologize for what happened the other day. I know I probably came off as rude and that wasn't my intention." The clerk blinked in surprise. "Oh, well, I didn't mean to—" "I get it," Keanu interrupted gently. "The way I acted probably seemed strange, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry if it made you uncomfortable." She stared at him for a moment, before nodding. I appreciate that." Keanu could feel the tension lifting, and for the first time in ages, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't the actor trying to manage his image. He was just a person, trying to live in a way that felt true to who he really was. As he walked out of the bakery, Keanu felt a quiet sense of pride. The story that the world had tried to tell him was not the story he had to live. It wasn't the headlines or the rumors that mattered. It was his own sense of integrity, his own journey toward authenticity. And as he stepped out into the sunshine, Keanu realized that maybe the bakery incident wasn't the humiliation he'd once thought. It was. It was a moment of clarity, a moment of truth. The days following Keanu's visit to the bakery had brought a new sense of calm into his life. He felt like a different person. It wasn't just the media that he had to face anymore. It was his own fears, his own sense of being misunderstood, and the constant pressure to live up to something he wasn't. And yet, as each day passed, he realized that he was beginning to accept that he could shape his own narrative. The phone call with Greg had gone better than expected. They agreed to sit down next week to discuss the details of his future projects, but this time, Keanu was clear about one thing. He was no longer willing to jump into anything just for the sake of it. He wanted to do work that was meaningful, that resonated with him, and that made him feel like he was making an impact beyond the screen. For the first time, Keanu was focused on his own well-being, not just the demands of an industry that often felt out of touch with reality. He began spending more time with friends outside the world of Hollywood. Emma, of course, had been there every step of the way, offering her support and encouragement. But now Keanu was reaching out to old friends, the ones he hadn't spoken to in years, the ones who knew him before the fame and the cameras. They shared simple moments, long conversations over coffee, hiking trips to the mountains, or quiet afternoons spent at home with no agenda. For the first time in a long time, he felt connected to people who saw him as more than just a public figure. One Saturday afternoon, Keanu sat in a local cafe, the same one where he had met with Greg, only this time he wasn't there for a meeting. He was there for the sole purpose of sitting and reflecting. It had become a ritual of sorts, a space where he could gather his thoughts, away from the pressures of the world. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself thinking about the incredible journey that had brought him here. The ups, the downs, the moments of success, and the humiliations. All of it had shaped him in ways he never imagined. A man walked in, holding the door open for his wife and 2 children. Keanu's gaze shifted toward them for a moment, and he realized that he was starting to see the world differently. It wasn't about the next big role or the latest headline. It was about the connections he made, the people he cared about, and how he could contribute to making their lives better. Fame, he had learned, was fleeting, But love, authenticity, and kindness were timeless. "Keanu, right?" a voice interrupted. His thoughts. Keanu looked up and smiled, recognizing the young woman who had approached him. She looked familiar, but not from the world of film. She was a regular at the cafe, someone he had occasionally seen around but never spoken to. "Yeah, that's me," Keanu replied, setting his coffee down. "I just wanted to say, I've seen you around here a few times, and I've always admired how you carry yourself. You seem like you're really focused on the important things in life," she said with a shy smile. Keanu felt a warmth spread through him. The compliment was simple but genuine. "Thank you," he said, genuinely touched. "It's been a long journey to get to this point," she smiled back. "I can tell. It's really inspiring. I think a lot of people look up to you, not just for your acting, but because you seem real. I guess that's not easy to find these days." Keanu was silent for a moment, taking in her words. He had never thought of himself as an inspiration to others, especially not in the way she described. But maybe, just maybe, that was the message he was meant to share with the world. Not the glossy, polished version that the media tried to sell, but the real, imperfect version of who he was. "Thanks. That means more than you know," he said, smiling warmly. The woman nodded, glancing at her watch before excusing herself. "It was nice to meet you, Keanu." "You too," he said as she walked away, a thought lingering in his mind. He realized that the most meaningful moments in life weren't the ones captured by the cameras or documented in headlines. It wasn't about the applause or the red carpets. It was about being seen and understood for who you truly were, not for the image that others expected you to project. Later that week, Keanu decided to take another step toward embracing his newfound peace. He reached out to the bakery where it all started, not to confront or challenge, but to make amends and offer a gesture of goodwill. It was a small personal gesture, but to him it felt like an important part of his journey. "Hi, this is Keanu Reeves," he said when the manager answered the phone. "I'd like to make a donation to the bakery, to support the staff, and to show my appreciation for the work you do. I've been thinking about my visit, and I want to turn that moment into something positive." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft laugh. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. That's really thoughtful of you." Keanu felt a sense of warmth wash over him. It wasn't about making headlines or doing something for show. It was about giving back, about turning a difficult experience into something that could help others, and that, he realized, was what truly mattered. The next day, he received a note from the bakery staff. It was a simple thank you card with a drawing of a warm loaf of bread on the front. Inside it read, "Your kindness made our day. Thank you for seeing us not just as workers but as people." Keanu smiled, folding the card and slipping it into his pocket. He knew that no matter what came next in his life, he would continue to focus on the things that truly mattered: his relationships, his own growth, and his ability to show up in the world with authenticity. And in that moment, Keanu realized that the world may never stop trying to define him. But as long as he stayed true to himself, it didn't matter. The bakery incident, the media frenzy, the public judgment, it had all been part of his story. But it no longer defined him. He had learned to embrace the uncertainty, to find peace in the chaos, and to write his own ending. As Keanu stood up from the cafe table, he felt lighter, more at ease than he had in years. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he was ready to face whatever came next on his own terms. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing you've done recently to embrace change and create a fresh start?